Welcome to this video where we tell Allison's heartbreaking story. What she heard in the kitchen shattered her world and turned her life upside down. So sit back and join us in this emotional story. But before you do, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Allison had always been a curious woman. She had a talent for uncovering secrets and a drive to get to the bottom of things. It's what made her such a successful writer. For over 20 years, she had been writing people's life stories, from the mundane to the extraordinary. She had a knack for getting people to open up to her, to trust her with their deepest secrets and desires. And in return, she wove their stories into captivating tales that touched the hearts of readers everywhere. But despite her skill at uncovering secrets, there was one secret that Allison couldn't seem to unravel. The secret that her husband, Mark, and his mother, Joan, were keeping from her. They had always been close, almost too close, and Allison couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they weren't telling her. She had tried to bring it up with Mark before, but he always brushed it off, saying it was just her imagination. As the years went by, Allison tried to put the nagging feeling out of her mind. She and Mark had built a life together, with 2 beautiful children and a comfortable home. But the feeling never went away completely, and sometimes it would rear its head at the most unexpected moments. One night, Allison was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when she heard a sound from the kitchen. She sat up in bed, listening intently. It was Mark and Joan. What were they doing up so late? She wondered. She strained her ears to listen, hoping to catch a snippet of their conversation. That's when she heard it. "I'm telling you, Joan, we can't keep this up forever," Mark was saying. "Allison is going to find out sooner or later." I know, Joan replied. "But what can we do? We can't just tell her. It would destroy her." "I know," Mark said with a sigh. "But we can't keep living this lie. It's not fair to Allison or to us." Allison's heart began to pound. What lie were they talking about? What could be so terrible that it would destroy her? She had to know. She got out of bed quietly and tiptoed down the hall to the kitchen. She stood outside the door, listening intently. "I just don't know what to do," Mark was saying. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. It's eating me up inside." "I understand, Mark," Joan said. "But we have to think about Allison. She can't find out. Not now, not ever." "But how long can we keep this up?" Mark asked. "She's bound to find out eventually, and when she does, it's going to be a disaster." Allison's mind was racing. What were they talking about? She had to hear more. She leaned in closer to the door, trying to catch every word. "I know, Mark," Joan said, "but we have to be careful. We can't let her suspect anything." "I'm just so tired of lying to her," Mark said. "She deserves to know the truth." "Mark, please," Joan said. "We've been over this before. We can't tell her. It would be too much for her to handle." Allison felt like she was going to explode. What could be so terrible that they couldn't tell her? Was Mark having an affair? Was Joan sick? Her mind was racing with possibilities, but she couldn't come up with anything that made sense. She had to hear more. "I just can't keep this up," Mark said. "I feel like such a hypocrite." "I know, Mark," Joan said soothingly. "But you have to remember why we're doing this. It's for Allison's own good. She can't handle the truth." "But what if she finds out?" Mark asked. "What then?" "We'll deal with it," Joan said confidently. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But for now, we have to keep up appearances." Allison's heart sank. They were talking about her like she was a child, like she couldn't handle the truth. What could be so bad that they had to keep it from her? She had to find out. She took a deep breath and pushed open the kitchen door. "Allison," Mark exclaimed, looking startled. "What are you doing up?" "I heard voices and I couldn't sleep," Allison said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Joan said quickly. "We were just talking about some family stuff." Allison could see the guilt written all over their faces. She knew they were lying to her. But she didn't press the issue. She just nodded and went back to bed, her mind racing with questions. As she lay there in the dark, she tried to make sense of what she had heard. But the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. What family stuff could be so bad that they had to keep it from her? She couldn't think of anything. Finally, exhausted from the mental gymnastics, she fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams haunted by whispers and secrets. Over the next few days, Allison tried to act as if everything was normal. She went about her daily routine, taking care of the kids, running errands, and writing. But all the while, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She tried to talk to Mark about it, but he was evasive. He acted as if nothing had happened in the kitchen that night, as if he didn't know what she was talking about. Joan was no help either. She was always sweet and caring, but there was a steely resolve in her eyes that Allison found unsettling. Allison knew she had to find out what was going on. She couldn't keep living like this, with the constant feeling of being left out of something important. One day, when Mark was at work and the kids were at school, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She went to the attic, where they kept all their old family albums and boxes of memorabilia. She rummaged through the boxes, looking for anything that might give her a clue. And that's when she found it. It was a photo album she had never seen before. It was old and faded, with a cracked leather cover. She opened it up and began to flip through the pages. The first few pages were filled with pictures of Mark as a child, with his parents and siblings. Allison had seen most of these pictures before, but she kept flipping through, hoping to find something new. And then she saw it. A picture of Mark and Joan standing in front of a gravestone. Allison couldn't make out the name on the gravestone, but she could see the sadness in their eyes. They were both young, probably in their 20s. Allison's heart began to race. What was going on? Who was buried in that grave? She turned the page and saw another picture, this one of a baby. It was Mark. Allison's hands shook as she turned the page again. This time, she saw a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local man killed in tragic accident." The article was about a young man who had been killed in a car crash. Allison's eyes scanned the article, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw the name. James Michael Sullivan. Allison gasped. That was Mark's middle name. She turned the page again and saw a birth certificate. It was for a baby named James Michael Sullivan, born on the same day as Mark. Allison's mind reeled. Was Mark a twin? And if so, why had she never heard about it? She turned the page again and saw a handwritten note. It was from Joan to Mark. The words were faded and hard to read, but Allison could make out some of it. Dear Mark, I'm sorry it had to be this way. I know you don't want Allison to know, but someday you're going to have to tell her. She deserves to know the truth. I love you and I'll stand by you, no matter what. Love, Joan. Allison's hands trembled as she read the note. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. There was a secret in her family, and it involved Mark and Joan and a baby named James. She had to find out what it was. She had to confront them. Allison closed the scrapbook and took a deep breath. She knew that confronting Mark and Joan was not going to be easy. She needed to prepare herself mentally for what was to come. She put the scrapbook back where she found it and walked back to her bedroom. Her mind was racing with questions and doubts. What was Mark hiding from her? And why had he kept this secret from her for so long? Allison lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep, her mind too consumed by the mystery. She wondered if Mark and Joan knew she'd have found the scrapbook. If they did, what would they say? What would they do? After what felt like hours, Allison finally drifted off to sleep. But her sleep was fitful and troubled. She dreamed of Mark and Joan and a baby named James. She dreamed of secrets and lies and betrayal. When she woke up the next morning, Allison felt exhausted and overwhelmed. She knew she had to confront Mark and Joan, but she didn't know how or when. All she knew was that her life was about to change forever. Over the next few days, Allison tried to act normal around Mark and Joan. She couldn't bring herself to confront them yet, not without knowing more about the secret they were keeping. But every time she saw them, she felt a pang of guilt and sadness. She wondered if they knew she had found the scrapbook, or if they were just carrying on with their lives as usual. One night, while Mark was out with friends, Allison couldn't take it anymore. She went into the spare bedroom where the scrapbook was hidden and started to look through it again. She read the note from Joan to Mark over and over, trying to decipher its meaning. She felt like she was getting closer to the truth, but she still didn't know what the secret was. As she was flipping through the pages, she heard the front door open. She quickly closed the scrapbook and put it back where she found it. She walked out of the spare bedroom and saw Mark standing in the hallway. "Hey," he said, smiling at her. Allison forced a smile back. "Hey, how was your night?" Dear viewer, before we continue, I want to ask you to subscribe to my channel, because it motivates me to make unique and interesting content for you every day. Thank you. Let's continue. It was good. Just hung out with some friends. What were you up to? Oh, just reading a book, Allison lied. She couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. Mark nodded and walked past her towards the bedroom. Allison followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wondered if he knew she was lying, if he knew she had found the scrapbook. But he didn't say anything, and soon they were both in bed, asleep. The next morning, Allison woke up to an empty bed. Mark had already left for work. She got up and went to the kitchen to make breakfast, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She decided to take the day off from work and try to figure out what was going on. She spent the day going through old photos and documents, trying to piece together the mystery. She found more clues, more hints at the secret Mark and Joan were keeping. She felt like she was getting closer, but she still didn't know what it was. That night, Mark came home late. Allison was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when he walked in. "Hey," he said, taking off his coat. "Hey," Allison said, putting down her book. "Where were you?" "Work ran late," Mark said, sitting down next to her. "I'm sorry I didn't call." "It's okay," Allison said. "Listen, Mark, I need to talk to you about something." "What is it?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing. "I found something," Allison said. "Something in the spare bedroom. It's a scrapbook, and it has all these photos and documents in it. And there's a note from Joan to you, and it talks about a secret." Mark's face went pale. "What kind of secret?" he asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Allison said. "Mark, what have you been hiding from me?" Mark hesitated before answering. Allison could see the fear in his eyes, and it made her heart ache. I don't know what you're talking about," Mark said, his voice shaky. "Don't lie to me, Mark," Allison said, her own voice rising. "I know something's going on. Why would you keep a scrapbook like that? Why would Joan write you a note about a secret?" Mark took a deep breath and looked away. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then tell me what it is," Allison said, feeling frustrated and angry. "I can't take this anymore, Mark. I need to know the truth." Mark looked back at her, his eyes full of tears. "It's about James," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "James?" Allison repeated, feeling confused. "Our son," Mark said, his voice breaking. "The one we lost." Allison's heart skipped a beat. She had known that Mark had been married before, but she didn't know he had a child. "What happened?" she asked, her voice softening. Mark took a deep breath and began to tell her the story of James, the son he had lost before he met Allison. It was a heartbreaking story of a baby born too soon, too weak to survive. Mark had never talked about it before, not even to Joan. But he had kept the scrapbook as a way to remember James, to keep him close. As Mark spoke, Allison felt her anger and frustration dissolve. She saw the pain in Mark's eyes, the sadness he had been carrying for so long. She realized that this was a secret he had kept out of love, not deceit. When Mark finished the story, Allison went to him and wrapped her arms around him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't know." "It's okay," Mark said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I should have told you before." Allison held him tight, feeling grateful for the honesty and vulnerability he had shown her. She knew that their relationship would be stronger for it, that they would be able to face anything as long as they were honest with each other. The next few days were a blur for Allison. She and Mark spent hours talking about James, about the pain of losing a child, and about the ways they could honor his memory. They talked about the scrapbook, and Mark showed her each page, each photo, each memory. Allison felt closer to Mark than ever before. She realized that the love she felt for him was deeper than she had ever known, that it extended beyond just the happy moments and into the painful ones. She felt lucky to have a partner who was willing to be vulnerable, who was willing to share his secrets with her. But even as she felt closer to Mark, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. She couldn't forget the conversation she had overheard, the one that had led her to the scrapbook in the first place. She knew that Mark had told her the truth about James, but there was still something else he wasn't telling her. One night, as they were lying in bed, Allison finally mustered up the courage to ask him. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Mark said, turning to face her. "That night, in the kitchen," Allison said, "when I overheard you and Joan, you were talking about something else, weren't you? Something that had nothing to do with James." Mark's face went pale again, and Allison could see the fear creeping back into his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't lie to me," Allison said, feeling her frustration rising again. "I know there's something else, Mark, something you're not telling me." Mark sat up in bed and ran his hands through his hair. "Allison, please," he said. "I can't tell you." "Why not?" Allison asked, feeling desperate for answers. "Because it's not my secret to tell," Mark said. "It's Joan's." Allison felt a surge of anger. "That's not good enough," she said. "You can't keep something from me like this. We're supposed to be partners, Mark. We're supposed to share everything." "I know," Mark said, his voice low. "But this is different. Joan trusted me with her secret, and I can't betray her like that." Allison felt torn. She knew that Mark was right, that he had a duty to keep Joan's secret. But she also felt hurt, like he was keeping something from her, like he didn't trust her enough to tell her the truth. "I understand," she said finally, "but it doesn't mean I have to like it." Mark sighed and lay back down next to her. They lay in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Mark spoke. "I promise you, Allison," he said. "Whatever it is, it's not something that will hurt us. It's not something that will affect our relationship. Please trust me on that." Allison thought about it for a moment. She knew that Mark wouldn't lie to her, that he was telling the truth as he knew it. And she knew that she loved him, that she wanted to trust him. But the nagging feeling in the back of her mind wouldn't go away. "I'll try," she said finally, "but I can't promise anything." The next few weeks passed in a haze for Allison. She tried to put the conversation with Mark out of her mind, to focus on her work and her relationship. But every time she looked at Mark, she couldn't help but wonder what he was keeping from her. They continued to spend time with Joan, and Allison couldn't help but feel like she was scrutinizing her every move, trying to find some clue as to what the secret could be. But Joan seemed the same as always, kind and loving and full of stories about James. One day, a few weeks after their conversation in bed, Mark came home with a package. He handed it to Allison with a smile. "What's this?" Allison asked, eyeing the package suspiciously. "Just open it," Mark said, his eyes sparkling. Allison tore open the package and found a framed photo inside. It was a picture of her and Mark, taken on a trip they had taken to the beach a few years ago. They were both laughing, the sun shining down on them. "It's beautiful," Allison said, feeling a lump in her throat. "I thought it would look nice in the living room," Mark said, grinning. Allison felt a rush of gratitude towards him. Despite everything that had happened, despite the secrets and the lies and the pain, Mark still loved her, still wanted to make her happy. She leaned over and kissed him, feeling a surge of passion that she hadn't felt in weeks. Mark responded eagerly, pulling her closer to him. For a few minutes, they forgot about everything else, lost in their own world of love and desire. But as they lay in each other's arms, Allison couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She knew that she was still keeping secrets from Mark, that there were things she had never told him about her own past. As much as she loved Mark, as much as she wanted to be honest with him, there were parts of her life that she was ashamed of, that she didn't want him to know about. But as she lay there, feeling Mark's heartbeat against her own, she knew that she couldn't keep those secrets forever. If she wanted to truly be with him, to truly be his partner, she would have to tell him everything. The next few days were filled with tension for Allison. She knew that she needed to tell Mark about her past, but she didn't know how to begin. She didn't want to hurt him, didn't want him to think less of her. But every time they were together, every time she looked into his eyes, she knew that she couldn't keep hiding the truth from him. One evening, as they were sitting on the couch watching TV, Allison took a deep breath and turned to Mark. "Mark, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked at her, concern etched on his face. "What is it?" he asked gently. Allison took another deep breath and began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I've never told you about my past, about the things I've done and the mistakes I've made. I've always been so afraid that you would judge me, that you would think less of me. But I can't keep hiding it from you, Mark. I love you too much to keep secrets from you." Mark reached out and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Allison, whatever it is, whatever you've done, it doesn't change how I feel about you. I love you, and I always will," he said. Allison felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been so afraid to tell him, so afraid of what he might say. But his words filled her with hope, with a sense of belonging. "Okay," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll tell you everything." Allison took a deep breath and began to speak. She told Mark about her childhood, about growing up in a small town and feeling like she never fit in. She told him about her parents' divorce and how it had left her feeling lost and alone. And then she told him about the mistakes she had made, about the drugs and the partying and the reckless behavior. She told him about the times she had cheated on boyfriends, about the times she had stolen from her friends. As she spoke, she watched Mark's face carefully, looking for any sign of judgment or disapproval. But all she saw was love and understanding. When she was finished, Mark took her into his arms, holding her close. "Allison, I'm so sorry you had to go through all of that," he said softly. "But it doesn't change how I feel about you. You're still the woman I love, the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." Allison felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had been carrying the weight of her past for so long, and now she felt like she could finally let it go. "Thank you," she said, snuggling closer to Mark. "Thank you for loving me, for accepting me, for everything." Mark kissed her forehead and held her close, his love surrounding her like a warm blanket. For a while, they sat in silence, simply enjoying each other's company. And as Allison looked around their apartment, at the pictures on the walls and the furniture they had picked out together, she felt like everything was going to be okay. Over the next few weeks, Allison and Mark's relationship only grew stronger. They spent their evenings cooking together, going for walks in the park, and snuggling up on the couch watching movies. Allison had never felt so happy, so loved. She knew that Mark was the one for her, the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. But even as she reveled in her happiness, she couldn't shake the memory of that night in the kitchen, of the conversation she had overheard. She knew that she needed to confront Mark, to find out what was going on between him and his mother. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, Allison took a deep breath and turned to Mark. "Mark, can we talk about something?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course," he said, turning to face her. Allison took another deep breath and began to speak. "The other night, I overheard you and your mother in the kitchen. You were talking about me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's expression turned serious, and he reached out to take her hand. "What did you hear?" he asked gently. Allison took a deep breath and repeated the conversation she had overheard. As she spoke, she watched Mark's face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or deception. When she was finished, Mark took a deep breath and leaned back against the pillows. "Allison, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I never wanted you to find out that way. I was planning to tell you, but I didn't know how." Allison's heart raced as she waited for him to continue. What was he going to say? What had he been keeping from her? "Allison, I know that I should have told you this before, but I have a daughter," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name is Emily, and she's 6 years old." Allison's heart stopped. A daughter? Mark had a daughter. Why had he never mentioned her before? "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Why haven't you told me about her before?" Mark looked at her with sadness in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Allison. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. I was afraid that you wouldn't understand, that you would judge me for not telling you sooner." Allison shook her head in disbelief. "I would never judge you, Mark. Why would you even think that?" Mark took a deep breath and looked away for a moment before continuing. "Emily's mother and I were never married," he said, his voice low. "We were together for a while, but it didn't work out. She moved away when Emily was born, and we've been doing a long-distance co-parenting arrangement ever since." Allison felt a pang of sadness for Mark. She couldn't imagine what it must be like to have a child so far away, to have to navigate the challenges of co-parenting without the physical presence of a partner. "But why didn't you tell me about her?" she asked, still trying to understand. Mark looked at her with tears in his eyes. "I was afraid, Allison. I was afraid that if I told you, you would see me differently, that you would think I was less of a man, less of a partner." Allison reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Mark, I would never think that. You're an amazing person, an amazing partner, and you're an amazing father, I can tell." Mark smiled weakly at her. "Thank you, Allison. That means a lot to me." For a moment, they lay in silence, holding each other's hands and processing what had just been said. And as Allison looked at Mark, she knew that she loved him more than ever before. Finally, Mark spoke up again. "There's something else I need to tell you, Allison. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Allison looked at him, her heart racing. What else could there possibly be? "I have a genetic condition," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's called Huntington's disease. It's a neurodegenerative disorder that runs in my family." Allison's heart sank. She had heard of Huntington's disease before, but she didn't know much about it. She could tell from the tone of Mark's voice that it was serious. "What does that mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "It means that there's a 50-50th chance that I have inherited the gene mutation that causes the disease," Mark said. "If I have it, I will eventually develop symptoms like muscle spasms, difficulty walking and talking, and cognitive decline." Allison felt tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't imagine what it must be like to live with a disease like that, to know that it was looming over your future. "And if you do have it?" she asked. Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "If I do have it, there's a 50-50 chance that Emily has inherited it too. And if she has it, there's nothing I can do to stop it. Allison felt her heart breaking for Mark and Emily. She couldn't even imagine the pain and fear they must be going through. "I'm so sorry, Mark," she said, reaching out to take his hand again. "I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Mark looked away for a moment before answering. "I was afraid, Allison. I was afraid that you would leave me if you knew. I was afraid that you wouldn't want to have children with me, knowing that there was a chance they could inherit the disease." Allison shook her head in disbelief. "Mark, I could never leave you, and I would never judge you for something that's completely out of your control." Mark looked at her, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Allison. That means everything to me." For a moment, they lay in silence, holding each other's hands and processing what had just been said. And as Allison looked at Mark, she knew that she loved him more than ever before, that she would stand by his side no matter what the future held. Eventually, Mark broke the silence. "I know this is a lot to take in, Allison, and I don't want to overwhelm you, but I needed to tell you everything." "I appreciate that, Mark," Allison said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And I'm here for you, whatever you need." Mark gave her a small smile. "Thank you. I mean that." They lay in silence for a few more minutes, lost in their own thoughts. But Allison's mind kept going back to the conversation she had overheard earlier. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. "Mark, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Of course," Mark said, turning to look at her. "I heard you and your mother talking earlier," Allison said. "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I just overheard something, and I couldn't help but listen." "What were you talking about?" Mark's expression darkened. "What did you hear?" "I heard your mother say that she was going to come to the hospital with you tomorrow. And I heard you say that you didn't want her there." Mark sighed. "I'm sorry, Allison. I didn't want you to hear that." "It's okay," Allison said. "But can you tell me what's going on? Why don't you want your mother there?" Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. "My mother has never been supportive of our relationship, Allison. She's never approved of you. And I don't want her there tomorrow when we get the results of the test. I don't want her there if it's bad news." Allison felt a lump form in her throat. She knew how important it was to have family support during times like this. But she also knew how toxic and damaging it could be to have unsupportive family members around. "I understand, Mark," she said. "But you don't have to go through this alone. We'll get through it together." Allison and Mark spent the rest of the night talking and holding each other. They didn't get much sleep, but they felt a sense of closeness that they hadn't felt in a long time. The next day, they went to the hospital together. Mark's mother was waiting for them in the waiting room, but Mark held Allison's hand tightly as they walked past her without saying a word. They met with the doctor, and after a tense few minutes, they received the news that the test results were negative. It was a huge relief, and Allison and Mark hugged each other tightly as tears streamed down their faces. As they left the hospital, Allison turned to Mark and took his hand. "I'm so glad that it's over," she said. Mark looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You were my rock through all of this." Allison smiled, feeling her heart swell with love for her husband. "I'll always be here for you, Mark, no matter what." After months of heartache and hard work, Allison and her husband were finally able to rebuild their relationship and create a new, stronger foundation for their marriage. It wasn't easy, but they both knew they wanted to stay together and fight for their love. Looking back on her journey, Allison realizes that it was the support of friends, family, and even strangers that helped her through her most difficult moments. She encourages anyone going through a similar situation to seek help and surround themselves with positivity and love. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share stories every day that will change the way you see the world. You will hear real stories from the lives of people who will not leave you indifferent. Thanks for watching.